Okay, before we move on to adding value and texture and whatnot, I just want to indicate our table plane here. And again, I can lightly draw through all of my forms so that I get one nice broad line. And I think I'm going to even start indicating where my shadows are going to land. I'm not filling these in with any kind of tone just yet, I'm just kind of outlining them. And I'm going to go in with my hard eraser and erase out some of my excess. And now from here, I'm going to open a new layer, and I'm going to start some of my rendering in there. And we'll go back from there once we have something we like, and we'll start merging some layers together. Okay, let's go back to our layers palette here, and we'll hit the plus icon to open a new layer. I'm going to go into my airbrush tool, and I'm going to use my brackets to size up my brush. I'm also going to make sure that my flow is pretty low because I just basically want to give my entire piece some simple value or tone. And I'm going to use this as a base. And since I don't want to disturb my base, once I have it to where I like it, I'm actually going to go in and click another new layer. And now I'll build most of my value in here. I'm going to size down my brush with the brackets. And I'm going to go for some of my immediate darker areas, like on the objects, like the inside of my box, and my coffee, and the back side of this canister. And what I want to do, because I'm on a new layer, I can go in with a bigger brush. If it's too dark, I can always use my Option key to hold down while I have the brush engaged, and my color picker will activate, and I can select a slightly lighter tone of gray. I'm going to get the back side of this canister, and I'll get fairly small and add a little more flow using my slider on the brush properties. I might go darker than that. Again, if you lost track of your brush properties, all you have to do is either double click the tool, or you can click the slider icon here at the top left of the toolbar. I'll indicate my core shadow on my apple. And before I start adding my ground shadows, I want to just concentrate on my shadows here on my actual objects. And the ground shadow would be called your cast shadow, because it is the shadow that all of the objects are casting onto the surface they're sitting on. Now I'm making the shadow a little darker on one side because as light is hitting it, and you can see from our reference point, obviously the light is coming from this area. It will diffuse and fall off. And now I'm going to go in with my hard eraser brush again. I'm going to size it up with my brackets. And I'm going to go in here and clean up my unwanted lines. I'm going to treat this cap as a separate object. for the time being. Just make sure you're careful and don't erase anything you want to keep. And if you do, just undo. And I'm going to quickly go back in with my airbrush tool. Select the darker color. If you want to go back to pure black, you can click here in your lagoon on the lower left in this color wheel, and you have some simple color setups there. And I'll just pick the black. And I will shade in this area. You can also experiment with the positioning of your layers. You can click on your line art layer if you like, and drag it by using this icon, this arrow icon at the top right, and drag it to the top. And you can see your outlines fall over our tone. I'm going to put it back at the bottom for now. And I'm going to continue on with my cast shadows. Right now, I'm going to go to my top layer, hit Command E, and merge it with my tone. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to drag this beneath my tone. And I'm going to pick my airbrush again. And I'm just going to start to paint in some of my cast shadows. Again, try to remember to use a bigger brush whenever you can. And use your hard eraser to erase any lines you don't want. Now I'm going to go back to my felt tip brush, and I'm going to render the rest of this using some simple rendering techniques like hatching and cross hatching. I'm simply going to go in here and start filling in some of this space with some diagonal lines to indicate a deeper shadow. Also going to remember that the inside of this box creates its own cast shadow. And I'm going to emphasize some of the cast shadows that I've drawn here with some more line work. Right now I'm just drawing diagonal lines. Let me undo these because I want to be mindful of my actual surface. So if you draw lines that mislead you, it might detract from your drawing. So keep in mind the actual plane, and that's the surface that we're drawing on here, this table, so that when we lay down our lines, we're not going against it. And I'll hit my hard eraser just to get some of this out of the way. And I'll go back to my felt tip brush. And to toggle tools back and forth, your last two tools can always be toggled using the letter S. I'm going to pick one of my darker tones here. And I'm actually going to undo that and go to my top layer and draw on this layer, just so that every line I draw is fairly visible. I'm going to continue to rough out my organic shape here. This is my apple, and it's organic because it has all these natural dimples. Also, when we talk about line quality, especially around edges that are falling into shadow, the outline should be a little darker. And to clean that up, we can hold our Option key and select the colors right beside it so that we can clean up those areas. Again, anytime I need a new color that already exists in my canvas, I'll just use the Option key to select it. I'll toggle my brush size with the brackets, as usual, so I can give this plate some dimension. And all you need is a thicker brush to add this bevel to my plate. You don't need to draw very fine line art to show the other dimension of the plate. I also want to be mindful that the light is hitting the top side of these objects, so that we notice my box here has 3 planes and 3 shades of darkness. We have the brightest on top, a mid-tone on the side, and the darkest on the inside. So I want to make sure that my top side is lighter than my side or inside. And I'm just using my felt tip pen to adjust this. I also want to be mindful of the hard highlights that are hitting the edge of the canister, and I'll make my brush really small with the brackets so I can draw on these fine details. Again, I'll select some of these grays. And when I want a thicker shadow or something a little richer, I'll go back and do what's called cross hatching. This is basically crisscrossing the lines you've already made while you were hatching. Just remember what I said earlier about the plane that you're working on, and make sure that your lines don't fight and make your eye confused as to the surfaces that these objects are sitting on. There's something called a contact shadow, which is a very dark shadow at the moment of contact, at the place of contact between an object and the surface it's sitting on. So we want to make sure it's just a little darker right at the line. And I'm going to make a nice big brush, and I'm going to lower my opacity. Again, I'll do this on a new layer just to be sure, just until I get the strokes that I want. And then I can always use my hard, or sometimes even my soft eraser, which is right beside the hard brush, the hard eraser brush, to blend these in. And I'll go back to my felt tip brush, lower my brush size. Make sure that my shapes are defined and that edges that I want to keep are still there and not lost. There are places for lost edges, especially here with shadow and at the base of the object where lines become blurred. I'm going to go back and pick some of this white and hit the highlight on the apple. And I'll just go back a few steps and make sure I do that carefully enough so that it looks nice. Go back and pick some of my darker tones. Adjust my shadows where I need to. We were talking about lost edges. You'll notice inside of this box there's definitely a third dimension, but because of the way the light is hitting it, the shadow makes it hazy inside. So that it's not so clearly defined, even though that we know it's there. And I'll go back in here and adjust my shadow. And I'll render my table plane just a bit. A nice big brush. Actually, I'll use my airbrush tool when I want a nice smooth transition. And I'll hit my hard eraser brush. And now that I have this in a place where I'm pretty confident, I'm going to actually start merging down by starting at the top layer and hitting Command E a few times so that now all of those objects are on one plane. And I think I'll go in and erase a bit. This section of the still life is completely blown out with light, or flooded with light, so it's okay that I go completely white here. And I'll go with my soft erase to kind of blur that edge. I'll use my airbrush tool again and select this gray, just so that I can fill this area in just a bit. And I'll go back with my felt tip pen, lower the brush size dramatically. And I'll even just rough in some of the wood texture detail that we see. Also, make sure I get this reflective shadow here the coffee is creating on the table. And I'll go back to my airbrush so that I can give this a nice soft taper. Go back to my soft eraser again and just carve out a nice frame or shape for my picture. Back to my felt tip pen, and I'll go in and just clean up some of this line art as I prepare to call this initial still life done. You can adjust your coffee level as you like. It doesn't need to be exactly as you see it in nature. Remember, this is only reference material that I have here, so I'm not feeling too obligated to make it an exact copy. And I'm going to get this last highlight here. And here you have our still life. I like to taper my edge here with just some design artifacts. These are totally up to you. You don't need to do anything. I just like to frame my art in some sort of graphic shape. And we'll talk about stuff like this further when we discuss composition. We can turn off our reference, hold down V, center this, and there you go. Enjoy your still life. I'm Fred Gago, and this is SketchBook Pro number 6 for Autodesk.